Hi, my name is Easton. This is my co-host Chris, and this is the RockFace Studios Game Design Podcast, Episode 3. How are you doing today, Chris?
Pretty good. Just been doing some work and then doing a little bit of research for this episode, trying to form some opinions for our heated debate.
Is it going to be heated? I don't know if that is necessarily a requirement. I'm
I
sure.
don't, yeah, I don't know that heated's the right word. I was just trying to spice it up, but
I'm sure if it is heated, it'll be better for the algorithm. Name the podcast, Easton and Chris ruin a friendship through this one topic or something. I'm sure that'll get the most
yeah.
eyeballs.
Are you on this episode? We are still friends. Like that's still a thing that's true. For all those that are worried.
All right, cool. Well, I wanted to start out a little bit different this time. I thought we might do a little bit of like a personal headline. I think we both have something kind of active in mind here. I know something Chris and I have talked a lot about. Actually, I wrote a whole article about this after a some tournament success in the card game Flesh and Blood. Just about kind of making sure that if you are big into gaming, especially when you're trying to compete at it or try to be really, really competitive in general, it's always good to make sure you really focus on your physical health. Obviously, that's good regardless of your gaming intentions, but most gaming has you seated, not very active, so it's really good to make sure that you have something in your routine that keeps your body moving, keeps you healthy. Um, my personal headline was going to be just snowboarding. I got into it last year. Chris has been doing it his whole life. But I feel like last weekend I went out snowboarding with Chris and another couple of friends and just had such a blast. I'm finally getting to the point where I'm going down these longer routes and not falling as much at least, and picking up speed and just having a lot of fun on the slopes. So, yeah, that's my personal headline. Just excited to get back out on the mountains, really, after that last session. What about you,
It's
Chris?
it's fun to see the progression, but there's still no lack of good falls to entertain me while y'all are
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had one that was like I forget what it was. I was helping my buddy move or something, but I was just standing still and I just like fell over. Like there was no catalyst. I was just standing still and just fell over.
Also, I was waiting on both of them, and they aren't really riding together, but somehow they both managed to wipe out pretty hard at the exact same time. That was a fun one to watch.
I don't know
So
which
the
part you're
joys of
talking about
teaching.
there.
It was right at the lift before the big steep hill.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah, Mo's pose went flying everywhere. You fell down relatively gracefully, but Mo's was not graceful there.
yeah, yeah. I'm learning how to fall down better, but anyway, it's been a blast. What about you, Chris? What you been up to?
Yeah, so competition is always something I'm interested in, whether that's card games or board games or internal competition, trying to improve myself. And one type of competition I've been missing for a while is any kind of physical competition because we've been playing competitive TCGs for a while that I feel like as an adult, like one competitive pursuit is about all you can fit in. Um, and so while Flesh and Blood has kind of fallen off, I've grown a love for tennis. It's probably the best sport as far as staying in shape that I've found. I've tried a lot of them. I really recommend that people check out tennis just for the type of movement you get to do and the demands it puts on you to chase this little green ball around. It's been pretty life changing, I'd say, just from a fitness level. I don't think I've been able to sprint since maybe just out of college, like at this speed. And sprinting isn't just, I hadn't really considered that sprinting isn't something I've considered doing as an adult at any point for any reason until tennis. And so it's a great exercise. And tennis is an interesting sport because there was a documentary I was watching. I believe it was Roger Federer, who's one of the greats, and he was comparing tennis to a chess match, and that really clicked for me. And then realizing how you gain skills that are sort of like pieces in a game that you can use or tactics in a game, and then you apply those skills in ways that benefit you, it starts to feel more like chess once you can apply those skills in a consistent way. And so it's been really fun to kind of apply a little bit of strategy I've learned elsewhere to my tennis matches.
Yeah, that's the nice thing about kind of being eclectic in gaming as well. It's just I feel like you're working out similar muscles. You're still just problem solving, and even if that's on a court playing tennis, you're still just problem solving, and those skills carry over. They're very kind of broad in their application. So if you continue to just challenge your brain, then um, when you go back to that competitive game or just that game you know and love, even if you haven't practiced that one, you'll come back with new skills and maybe even be better, um, even for not having tested that one at all. So it's very good. I definitely recommend stay eclectic. I feel like sometimes I've really focused on like one main thing, especially when it comes to games, and I've gotten a lot of value in the last couple of years, just kind of broadening my horizons a little bit more. Keeps you from getting kind of too burnt out on any one thing. Keeps it fresh when you come back to it, and as long as you're working out similar skills, um, you're gonna keep on developing in all of them. So. Um,
It's all about that balance.
yeah, definitely. Cool. Um, I wanted to also kind of transition us into briefly talking about the Cardboard Edison Award. So, February is pretty much coming to an end, and we have gotten our feedback about our submission. We did not make it to the final round, um, and I think they said there were almost 400 submissions, and only a handful that made it there. So, um, congratulations to those who did make it to that final round. But we were really happy to see quite a lot of feedback that they wrote up for us. And yeah, for anyone interested in doing this for future years, I would say the feedback alone is definitely worth it. Again, only $25 barrier to entry, and of course the time and effort in making the video and the game before that. Um, and I think there were 5 or 6 judges that gave anywhere from a few sentences to a couple paragraphs of feedback. Um, and I feel like yeah, the especially the ones that gave really thorough paragraphs with their feedback, those are going to be really interesting to delve into and dissect. Chris and I still have to kind of go through that feedback and do a little post-mortem together. We'll probably consolidate some of that feedback and then talk about them in kind of larger contexts for a future episode. So we look forward to sharing that with you. Maybe next month that's what we do. Um, but of course, for this month, we have to ruin the friendship, with our our argument over this debate. Yeah,
They had a few more things in there. One of the, besides just straight feedback, they gave you ratings based on three primary categories. It was 1 through 7 on each scale. So that was nice to see an overall rating. It'd be interesting to see what the other games got to where, what threshold was a successful game. The finalists are released on the webpage as well. If you look up cardboardedison.com/award, or we can put a link after the video, you can see it's roughly 20, I think, or so games that did make the finals that will be going after the grand prize that's announced in April. If y'all want to keep up with that, I've watched a few of them. There's some interesting ones in there, and there's also a wide range of games. Some are even, I would say, on the heavier side, while the majority of them are still pretty light.
yeah, it seems like we were a little bit worried that some elements of this game were like too complex, but honestly, some of the feedback was push the complexity even further.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like they accept a wide array of games. I
Yeah.
imagine that that they probably just have an overwhelming number of more simplistic games in general, which is probably explains the ratio that ends up getting in.
Mhm.
I think initially we thought that might have a preference for those types of games, but I think thinking about it and seeing what has made it through, I think it makes sense that probably just a vast majority of them are a little bit kind of lower key, um, and it really comes down to um, those kind of grades that Chris mentioned that decides whether or not they make it to that final round, and not about the complexity. Um, but
We also have a list of judges that judged each board or judged all the board games, and you can see some of their credentials. So it was nice to go through the email and kind of cross reference with what credentials. I know we had some award winning game designers reviewing our game, which was pretty cool. So they kind of have the whole gambit of judges, and I agree that the feedback was quite valuable. The process was quite valuable, even though we didn't get the result we were hoping for. I think that in hindsight, I would still do it again.
yeah, I'm looking forward to doing it again. Um, maybe even do two submissions next year. Maybe we'll be prepared enough for that. Uh, Okay, we do have our main topic pending, but I had one other kind of segment I wanted to get into here. It's actually something I had planned to do at the end of last podcast, but we kind of ran out of time talking about the Cardboard Edison Award. And it's just an opportunity for Chris and I to share a little bit about something we have learned already about game design. Um, I think this is going to be anywhere from our own subjective, um, you know, ideas about what matters in game design to more kind of objectively just good tenets to follow. But it's probably going to be a recurring segment. Um, the one that I wanted to talk about a little bit was just mechanics that benefit players who are behind and avoiding mechanics that benefit players who are ahead. Um, I think this is a pretty obvious one. I think a lot of people know that this is something that is good. I think a lot of people look out for that comeback from behind mechanic. I think just a couple thoughts that I've had recently about this design is a little bit more emphasis on avoiding designs that benefit the player who's ahead. Um, I think that I've seen some examples recently in some games where some game pieces are designed to kind of like say, if you're ahead, then get this extra bonus. And I think that those are like in almost all cases pretty bad designs. I don't think that there's really any reason to design cards like that because ultimately you have most of your game pieces are just going to be um, usable and valuable within the context of the game, and that's going to be the status quo. People who are ahead can continue to use those resources, use those mechanics, use those game pieces to maintain or even push to get a greater lead just in the same way that they were able to get their lead to begin with when they started on an even playing field. So you don't need something to benefit them. If a player has navigated the game to that state where they are advantaged, they'll probably be able to find a way to do that again, um, just through the same means that they used before. Um, and so I think really trying to avoid those like the plague, unless there is like a really good contextual reason to include that, you just want to avoid any kind of language about if you're winning in some capacity, do this. Now, sometimes you say you might have like a if you're ahead on this track, then you can get this bonus. That's different because you're making ongoing progress towards a sort of like a victory condition or an extra kind of award for maybe being first or something. I think there's some room there to play with, and I've seen that work pretty elegantly in the past. But just generic, more generic, like if you are the point leader, for example, get this bonus. I think that as an example is just not great. And then of course the come back from behind, similar to how I think there's almost never a good reason to like reward the person who's ahead just for being ahead. I think there's usually not a very good reason not to have a mechanic that gives someone the opportunity to come back from behind. I think almost every game could benefit from having some sort of tool, some sort of mechanism that players can point to and lean on to say, okay, that turnaround didn't go my way or whatever, that exchange didn't go my way. I know where I need to kind of like put my energy into to potentially get back in this game. I think we've all had experiences where we've played games and something bad happens pretty early on, and you feel like you're just you can kind of never claw back from that initial issue. And so you might spend 2 hours playing a game, and in the first 30 minutes, you realize that you're out of it. That's not fun. So I think
That's probably the biggest thing that I would avoid is that
yeah,
if somebody's in a game and they can identify they have no chance of winning, that sort of kills the fun for the whole table
yeah,
because then that person becomes like a rogue that just tries to cause chaos because they can no longer help themselves. And so, whichever of these you're aiming for, I think giving players at least the feeling that they're involved in being able to win the game is very important at all times. Very important.
definitely. Yeah, like I said, I think it's a pretty basic design tenet, but it's something that I've had some specific thoughts about, so I wanted to share a few of those. Anything else you'd share about that, or do you want to kind of share about your thing you've learned you have prepared, Chris?
Just a couple comments on yours. I think that it's an interesting topic depending on how you approach it, and I think a lot of positive reinforcement rather than negative. So instead of punishing the leader in these scenarios, it's better to facilitate the person that's losing. It's just kind of more fun forward, and the direct attacks are always a tricky thing in games, and so anytime you have a chance to push more fun for someone versus taking fun away from someone. I think that's a interesting thing to consider. And then also, there's I don't know if I need to go into this there, so I'll just go very lightly into it. I think mechanics that take away things is like blocking spaces or things like that can potentially be improved by giving benefits to the person that was there first besides instead of saying the other player can't have fun because someone's already there, give a benefit to the player that took that space first. So it's just kind of like a very, I guess I'll make a term up, fun forward way to approach it that I've seen in a few games that kind of turn it on its head where they find a way to insert more fun where instead it could be a negative experience and it keeps the balance the same. So any way you can have the players have a positive, rewarding experience that still keeps the balance and competitiveness going, I think it's a good approach.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Yeah, not even much more to add. The one thing I will add is, and you want to make sure that that I guess the comeback from behind mechanic isn't so good that the person who worked really hard for their advantage loses it for no good reason. And that's a very tight balancing act, and it's always the push and pull. And this is why design's so fun because even after we decide that like yeah these are definitely things you want to do in general, you have to do it elegantly as well. And if you don't, then that's also going to be frustrating for the person who worked really hard for a victory and maybe got a snatched for reasons that don't seem fair to them. You want it to
Mhm.
feel like you get rewarded for doing well, but also that you're not just out of the game because one thing didn't go your way. Um, cool.
Maybe a question to ponder and even a good debate for future is should your balance against the leader be dependent on other players identifying that they're in the lead and taking action against them? I think that's always like an interesting dynamic that happens at the table where
Yeah.
you have like some people paying attention to who's in the lead or some people correctly or incorrectly identifying who's in the lead, and it's sort of part of the balance mechanism of a lot of games. I don't know that that's the right way to do it, but it would be an interesting topic or just something to think about.
That's a deep rabbit hole because then you're getting into the topics of
Not right here, yeah.
politics at the table, which I know everyone knows and loves. Uh, and yeah, but no, that'll be an interesting topic for sure. What about yours? What's the thing that you've learned about design recently you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, so we've had some interesting design discussions based around boards and how you interact with boards. And we've had some games that we've designed that used TCG style rectangle cards that moved on a board. And it was a cool game and it was fun to interact with the pieces. And my crappy feedback, the best I could do was this doesn't feel good to play. and It was a rectangle card on a rectangle board, moving on like I think maybe a 5 by 5 grid or something like that.
Are you talking about good
Um,
neck or
no, I'm talking about our design that I couldn't really figure out. Like it doesn't feel right. Something doesn't feel right
yeah,
about it. And so then, what Easton just mentioned, there's a card game called Goodnack that I found this year at PAX. It's a 1v1 kind of just destroy your opponent's base or tower strategy game. And they have square cards. And it's such a little small change to this rectangle board that it really blew my mind when I sat down and played it. I think it has something to do with human psychology that a rectangle doesn't feel as true to movement as a circle or a hex or a square. It just inherently feels less restrictive to interact with. And it was like taking a breath, like, oh, this is the issue with a rectangle for me over a different type of board shape. So, one of my tenets to try to avoid is a rectangle card that moves around a board in trying to emulate what a human type movement might be. I think there's just a little bit of a psychological disconnect to feel connected to that movement. And it took me I think a whole year to even be able to describe what I didn't like about that game
yeah.
that we originally designed. But it's just a little tweak and it made a huge difference.
Yeah, I've messed around with a lot of kind of card games that work off of a board which includes movement. I've made a couple games like that. Uh, 7, 8 years ago, I worked with three or four of my friends, and we designed this game called Titan Siege that never quite made it into the big leagues, but it had the same kind of a thing. And then I kind of reworked it a little bit. And I think that's what I demoed to Chris that he's kind of talking about. And yeah, he definitely had like a pretty strong like aversion to it. You know, it's like it definitely like just didn't feel quite right. And I think what he's saying makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like putting a square peg in a rectangle. What's the saying people say? Putting a
Square peg round hole.
yeah, that one. It's kind of like doing that where it's like these cards are really not, they're not designed for a movement-based game. But that doesn't mean you can't really merge the two genres, but maybe the solution is just making them those squares. But it's also funny because you had TCG players play that good in that game, and they were like, "What are these squares?" That was kind of my
Yeah.
reaction too. I was like, "What are these squares?" I'm like shuffling them in my hand. I'm like, "This feels weird. This doesn't feel
Yeah.
quite right either." So I don't know. It's an interesting topic for sure.
There's probably not one face answer to say this is always the way to do it, and that's what design usually comes down to. It's whatever fits your game.
Yeah,
And if you decide to use rectangles, just know that the movement will not feel as human as it would if you used a different mode like a hex like D&D or a square like Dungeons and Dragons would, but at the same time, when you move outside of the standard, like to a square card versus a rectangle, card gamers will be like, "What's this in my hands? I don't like the feel of these things." So it's
yeah.
always a give and take for sure.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, if I have a card on a board and I do one movement forward or I do one movement to the side, I'm traveling a further distance going forward than I am going to the side. But in game, that's very likely to be, if something has one movement, you probably could do either of them equally. And so it does have a weird feeling to it where it's like this just doesn't quite feel like I'm replicating a real world experience even if you have great game pieces, great art, whatever it may be, it just doesn't quite feel right. Um,
I did talk to the good neck designers at PAX as well, and because it was a ongoing discussion that Easton and I were having about design, I got to ask them the same question, and they had found a similar reasoning for moving away from rectangle cards to design with their square cards. And, like we discussed, it's not a win in all categories, but I do think for movement purposes, it was a win for me.
they also found an elegant way of like simplifying what shows up on the cards, where I feel like there's only so much information on those things.
Yeah.
It's still a good strategy game. It'll definitely work out the brain. It's not as deep as maybe TCGs are in general, but it'll definitely be a fun puzzle to solve with
Mhm.
other strategically minded friends. Um, but they found a pretty elegant way of just having just a couple icons and a little bit of a few words, and then get a lot of points across. And so you don't really need the space of a rectangle card anyway, because it's basically the shape of a normal card, but just the top one third or so cut off. It's so they're kind of small as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Check
but
out Good Neck. It's a fun game and pretty low price point for what you get to.
yeah, very fun. All right. Hopefully you enjoyed that. We're gonna transition into our main topic. So this is going to be kind of meant to be a debate. Chris and I talked a little bit about maybe some design concepts that we disagree on. We haven't really had this conversation before, so you're kind of going to be able to experience kind of just yeah, the very beginnings of us having this conversation. I'm curious to know if by the end of this, either of us change our kind of position at all. We both are coming loosely. We talked enough to know that we're coming from loosely opposite sides, but um, I feel pretty strongly in mine. I don't know how strongly Chris feels in his. And yeah, we're just gonna keep it super casual, get into it. Um, I'm going to present the topic first, and then I'll share my kind of general perspective. Chris can share his, and then we'll kind of get into the nitty gritty. Um, the idea is whether or not we've been doing a lot of writing rules for games. We were focusing a lot on that for this Cardboard Edison Award. I've been writing a lot of rules because I just have too many games I've designed, and so it's kind of top of mind now. Something I was reminded of that I learned a while back. Or I developed an opinion on a while back. I was reminded of as I was reading through Chris's rules for the Fibonacci's Harmony, is this idea of whether or not you give any strategic advice in the rulebook. And this could also be true of like a tutorial, if especially if it's like an online game and you're learning how to play for the first time. Do you give any strategic advice when you're introducing the rules, or do you just introduce the rules and allow the person playing it 100% agency to come to their own conclusions? So that's the topic we're talking about. My general opinion is that you shouldn't really give any strategic advice. Um, that the rule book should be sort of this, um, I guess by definition, this kind of this common language that you both are agreeing to speak together. These rules that you are both agreeing to follow, and then if that's understood and accepted, and you both sort of opt into this experience with each other, then each person is able to then sort of put their own identity, their own thoughts, their own way they see the world, their own way they see and interpret this game. Not interpret insofar as this is how I see this rule versus yours, but this is how I see extrapolating these rules into how I can strategically maybe get to a winning position, and you see it kind of differently. I see this point of power, and I really want to lean on that, and you see a completely different point of power, and you really want to lean on that, and then we sort of have that play out, and then let the you know let the cards fall as they may, or whatever that saying is. I'm good on my sayings today. Um, the so I yeah, generally speaking, I like this idea of this kind of common language that you both learn and agree to, and then that's all it is, and then everything else is on the person to kind of come to those conclusions. It also, if you if you give strategic advice, then you kind of cut the legs off of the journey that the players are able to go through from picking up this new game, excited to play it, learn the rules, do their first playthrough, learn a lot, do another playthrough, learn even more. The growth that they have and the journey of discovery on that game, if you give them kind of advice on how to go, you're kind of leading the witness in a way where um, you as the designer and the writer of the rules are dictating the rules of engagement and how that first game especially is going to play out in a way that might feel, and I think usually when advice is given, it's coming from a place of the designer saying, okay, I could see if they if they don't understand this concept really, really well from the start, I could see them getting into some trouble. I could see them getting into a spot where they could really struggle in the game. And I think this is the crux of the counter argument. And I'll let Chris expand upon that. But I think the crux of the counter argument is helping them to improve that first experience. And I think that's probably going to be where most of this debate comes in because there are good arguments on the other side of things. But I think the leaning into the journey of discovery, letting them succeed or fail on their own, I think is going to create a more organic experience. And I think at the end of the day, on average, probably a more enjoyable one. But that is probably where the debate is. So, all
Mhm.
right, I think I've shared enough. Chris, you jump in here and tell me kind of where you're coming from on this topic.
Yeah, so I've done a little bit of research on this, kind of reviewed some of my memorable either gaming experiences or I'm often the person in our friend group that's teaching a game for the first time. I'm always reading the rules and then teaching it to a group. So I also picked some that I thought were particularly good uh, learning experiences for me and then translated to also for the person I was teaching because those can vary wildly. But I think my viewpoint after the research is that I do lean more towards there are times and places where strategic advice is acceptable to give in the context of a rule book. But in reviewing these scenarios, I've also refined that a little bit. We can get into it. And so I think the debate is what you mentioned, but I also think the debate is about learning styles. And one thing rulebooks have gotten better with over time is catering to multiple learning styles. And so you have the auditory learner, you have the reading learner, you have the visual learner, and then I would add in you have the example learner. Or the kind of person that likes spoilers to a movie or will look up how to get past the puzzle in their video game, you know. And so I'm thinking of this person that wants the examples as this fourth type of learner that likes that little kind of nudge in the direction to the strategy. While I agree at the same time that what Easton is describing, this person that likes the discovery would be dissuaded by having strategy fed to them rather than having the experience of discovery on their own.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you have a list here of some games that you kind of looked up. Do you want to run through those and kind of talk a little bit about whether they do or do not kind of have any strategic advice in their rules?
Yeah, so I kind of got just a wide range of both complexity. I tried to pick some games that were a little bit older and then more recent ones, and then just kind of go through the rule book and see how much strategy they included. So I looked at Splendor first. Splendor had no, and I'm not going to go into the description of all these games. If you're curious, I would say just look them up to see. But Splendor is an older, very popular, widely sold game. They had no strategy examples except for they would do some mechanical examples of how to play, not really indicating how that applies to strategy. I then looked at another older one called Dominion. Um, it's one of the original deck builders. They had literally no strategy at all in their rulebook. That was a pretty lengthy rulebook. And you can think like the original deck builder probably had a lot more explaining to do because there's not as many learned concepts. So I thought that was interesting. They left out any strategy. Gloomhaven, very popular, very heavy and complex game. It took me like 2 years to finish this campaign. It's a co-op campaign you play with your friends. Gloomhaven, the rule book was massive. I think it was the biggest one I reviewed for this, maybe with the exception of Oath. But Gloomhaven gave literally no strategy, except they did do mechanical examples, but those weren't even leaning towards giving strategy. So it seems like they really had an intention to stay away from giving strategy with Gloomhaven. Um, and then let's see, I think that the last one that doesn't give as much strategy, Roth, is a game from Chip Theory Games. It's a co-op or PVE battler. Um, this one I put on the list because it's a more recent game that was probably the easiest teach that I've had in a long time. And so I really appreciated this rule book and I really appreciated the depth that you got along with the complexity of rules being reasonable. They had no strategy in their rule book. And so I thought that's probably the one game that I would say is probably the most outstanding teach and learn for myself that I've ran into over the last couple years. And so that one, not having any strategy, was a very interesting point to me. And now I'll go to a few games that did have strategy. So Dune Imperium, one of mine, Easton's favorite games. I think also Dire Wolf is just an excellent game design company. I've found a lot of games that I like from them. Clank is another one that we play often. They left the strategy out of their rules, and so their rules were very clean and succinct. But then they had a whole page of strategy um, dedicated specifically to, I think, the people that want to read that page. If you want the rules, those are somewhere else. But here's strategy if you're that kind of person. And I thought it was interesting because Dune is a pretty deep game, which we can get into a little more about how they included this. I'll just continue with my descriptions. But I thought that was interesting that Dune had a whole page. That was very unique for Dune to do. Dice Throne, uh, primarily a 1v1 dice roller battler. They went very light, but then just here and there they said strategic tip and they had it in italics and they'd put a little tip in. And I think that was particularly interesting because it sort of points out a pain point that they found with their game that they chose to give a tip on rather than cleaning up the pain point, which I think could go, if the juice is worth the squeeze, keep it is sort of the design lesson. But they did have to make a tip in the rule book to cover that. And then lastly, I thought one of the coolest examples of strategy in rule books was Oath. And so Oath is a like kingmaker type game. That's not the right word. Kingmaker is a bad word for bad game design, but it's a game where you're trying to be the winning faction, and it's a game that plays out over many sessions. It's a really complex, very highly political game. Um, with a lot of obscure concepts in it. So Oath comes with multiple rule books, and they actually ask you in what context you are learning the game and what context you prefer to learn the game. And so they had like I think it was called like the rule of law, where they had a almost text only rule book that was only recommended for the true lawyers or heavy gamers. They recommended it in their rule book. Go here if you're this type of person. And then they had an option for a full scenario playthrough that was guided by the rulebook, which and in that they gave strategy. And so they actually gave you multiple paths depending on your preference. But man, these were lengthy, very long, drawn out rule books. And so they chose to put just a lot of ink on the page and take up a lot of space and potentially, scare people off just by the depth of it. But Oath is a very deep game. So I could see like offering these options as a good way to get into this. And then when I learned Oath, it was nice. I sat down, I didn't read the rule book. They had packs of cards set up and staged in the way that went along with their tutorial. And so if you wanted to play the tutorial, you open it and it's already stacked in the way that does the examples. And so you have like, you can reset it, but you have like a one time introduction to this really streamlined scenario experience to where I've tended to like these type of things to where you play the game as you're learning it and they introduce concepts along the way and kind of spoon feed you the rules when you're ready to like grasp the bigger idea. And Oath, with how complex it is, teaching that way was a very positive experience for me rather than reading the rule of law, which I think would have just been overwhelming to approach that game. So that's the research I did. I think that from this, there's like, in my opinion, not one answer that's always right, which is like every design ever. But I'm still leaning more towards ultimately, I would probably cater to the person that wants to learn via having some strategy available to them.
Yeah, the Oath one's really interesting. I feel like that is such a big ask on the designers to make that many different versions of rules. It's
Yeah.
great in theory. I mean, like if you can appeal to everybody, it's pretty hard to make a really strong argument against that.
Hmm.
Um, but again, it's just a matter of bandwidth, really. I mean, that's so much effort to put into it. I do think having a strategic guide kept separate is it's interesting. I think I'm still generally against it. I just don't think that's the role of the designer. I don't think it's your job. I like you care about strategy insofar as when a game is played at a high level, is it balanced? And that matters also when it's at a low level, maybe even more importantly, there's probably you and I are very kind of our brains are very focused on the more strategic side of things, and that's a pitfall we fall into because the majority of gamers, I'd say, probably um, are really focused on the fun more than the strategy. Personally, I get the fun out of the strategy, but I think I'm in the minority there. Um, and so, anyway, I'm kind of getting off topic, but as a game designer, you care about the strategy insofar as you want to make sure that the game's balanced. So that is a job you have. But beyond that, I don't know if it's really your job to give strategic advice to the players because ultimately you could test a game into oblivion and you're still gonna miss stuff. Like you're gonna miss lines of play. You're gonna miss ways that people can interact with the game and navigate their way through a game that are just blind spots for you. And the best you can do is have just good solid like a really solid like bedrock, I should say, of math. Like you want your game to be backed up by some math that feels balanced no matter what direction people go. And then ultimately you want to give them like kind of like a just a sandbox to play in. And so to sort of put yourself into this role of like I reign supreme from a strategic perspective because I designed this game and I know better than you. In a way, it's a little bit of a harsh way of saying it, but to that there's a little bit of that in having this sort of section of like this is the way that you should play the game in a way. These are good strategies to follow. So I think if you do want to have something like that, keep it pretty broad. Keep it pretty like getting someone from on a scale of level 1 to 10, get someone from level 1 to level 3 or something. Don't try to touch on some of the higher level strategy things because I think the further you go down that track, the more you're getting out of your own depth. And if you consider yourself somebody who can like write up a strategic guide and not miss anything, then you're probably just kidding yourself in a way. Um, I don't know if you have any
I
thoughts
agree
about
with
that.
the depth part of it that you're talking about. I think you do want to definitely leave some of that or the majority of the discovery to the players. But I think that balancing sort of all or nothing type of viewpoint on this, I think what I'm asking myself is how do I get the players to the fun most successfully and in a way where they want to keep coming back and engaging with that? Because if, like Dune, for instance, and Direwolf, I've replayed their game so many times now that when they put out a new game, I'm likely to go check that game out because I've had consistent fun with all of their games.
Yep.
And so if I feel like the strategy is too occluded for the players to discover it at a rate that will lead them to fun before they move on to another game, that's where I think the place for some strategic advice is. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet is that the person that gets the strategic advice in a group from the rulebook is usually one person. And so the person that's teaching a game usually has the discretion to either to know their group and teach in a way that includes strategic advice or leave it out. And it sort of gives the teacher that tool to where they're not needing to play through before they can offer that to someone. And so it does take some of the fun away from the teacher if they're the type that likes full discovery, but it still allows them that sort of toolbox to have if they have the type of group that's just like wanting a little tip. Like, here's a tip
Yeah.
that you might give them.
So counterpoint to that though, because if we're looking at the way that these games are usually played in groups, it's I would say pretty infrequent if you just take an average of all game nights of all time. I would say it's infrequent that everyone's learning a game from scratch at the same time. Usually there's somebody who's played the game before, and they are teaching. And so like I kind of go back to this point of like, is it our job as designers to be the one to kind of protect that first player experience? Because also you can just trust that player who's introducing this game to their group to do that for them. If they've played it once or twice or three times, they've seen those pitfalls. They know the things that the advice is say, hey, I'm just going to tell you, like, maybe on this one thing on this first turn, maybe don't go here, maybe don't do this action because X, Y, and Z. Like if there is some sort of strategic advice that needs to get someone from level 1 to level 3 out of 10, maybe you can trust that person who's introducing it to the group to be able to come to that conclusion on their own. And in doing so, you also, to your point of like maybe that person who does want to have the complete journey of discovery, you let them have that as the person who actually did read the rules. They played it a couple times. They love this game. They want to introduce it to people. They can be that. They can be that barrier. You can trust that person, that player who advocates for your game, to advocate for in a way that that you can kind of stand behind as a designer when they're teaching it to other people. Just a
Mhm.
counter argument to that.
Yeah. I think, even that I'm arguing for these being in the rule book, my own preference when I'm teaching a game for the first time, I usually skip over the strategy part because I just think it's extra fluff on top of the rules
Yeah.
that I don't want to spend the time on. But at the same time, as a teacher, sometimes I do have people in the group that I feel like they're just looking for some kind of strategy. And I think as a designer, you want to consider that the first playthrough is probably the most critical one for a group, whether they decide to come back to that game or rather they think this is a mess. I'm going to spend my time playing something else. So I think as a designer, it is your job to do that because there will be a first playthrough for the teacher that is usually, I think it's rare for the teacher to play through um, like running four hands and doing a four-player game on their own. It's more common that maybe they have one partner they learn games with, or maybe they have a group that has the patience to sit down and learn a game. I do think that's pretty uncommon that usually the teacher has done some homework before they introduce it to a new group. But there's always that first session, and that first session I would say is the most critical if it ever comes back off the shelf or not. And like coming back to Oath, there was a downside to their system because I learned it in the way that I described with like the tutorial that walked me through all of it, and then I didn't play it for a while. And I didn't want to come back and do that tutorial because, well, I'd already played that version of the game and the rule book was still really complex. So I was in this weird rabbit hole where I didn't want to reread the rules or redo the same game I'd already done. I ended up not playing it for years until a friend offered to reteach it, and it was really fun. But you do have to be careful making a really complex rule book like that is intimidating to even reread.
Yeah.
Um, so they put so much in that one that it was intimidating to come back to even.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Agreed there. I want to transition to another kind of topic I wanted to have about this, which is I think again when you want to give strategic advice, it's really to kind of protect them, to kind of say, oh, you poor little thing, I want to protect you for this first experience in a way. Because you know that if they get off track strategically in some specific ways, it could really it could make their experience bad. So that's a good intention. Now, I think that there is an argument to say that. Let me take a step back and I'll come back to this point. I actually thought of this example when you were talking, but when I was in college and I had to write a paper, um, I had one of those situations where I was just writing and writing and writing and spent hours, and then my computer shut down and I never pressed save, and so I had written like a whole essay, and then I had to rewrite it the night before. And I remember telling my teacher, I told them about this. I'm like, I know this sounds like my dog ate my homework, but literally, I had the whole thing written out, and I was really happy with it, and then I had to kind of rewrite it. And then I just remember it really stuck with me what she said, which was that I think she said that it's natural to feel that way, but I think in most cases you end up getting a little bit too precious about that initial work you did because you went from 0 to 90%, and that was so much investment that you put into it, that you feel protective of it. But then ultimately what ends up happening is if you are forced to rewrite something like that, then it's just going to come out better the second time, and you're able to get from that 90% you left off and then maintain that and kind of get it up to 95% or even 100%. You can really kind of polish maybe some of the rough edges that as you're writing it and you're finishing these paragraphs and you're calling them good, you don't want to go back and don't want to rework it because ultimately I have a deadline, I want to submit this paper, I have a life. But when you're forced to rewrite it, then you're forced to see it in kind of a new light and carry over all of the experiences you have from that first time writing it and then do it all again. Why am I saying this? I think that in game design, what?
I was like, when do we tie this to what we're talking about? Because I
I
wasn't
think
following.
I think in game design nothing is sacred. I think that it's really easy to design something, a game element, a part of the rules, whatever it might be, and then get really attached to it. I know I fall prey to this all the time. So this is more of a do as I say, not as I do. But it's something I'm trying to work on improving is not getting too attached to aspects of my design, not getting attached to any one game element or piece or whatever, saying nothing is sacred. I went from 0% to where we are now, and I did that all right. So I can trust myself to say, I'm going to just throw this whole thing that feels big, feels like I can't throw it away because it's so integral to the game. I'm going to throw it away, and I'm going to start at close to 0% of the game again, but it's going to be okay because I did it the first time. I can do it again. And I can do even better this time. So that's how I'm tying it in. Now that I've said this, I think that oftentimes when you want to give strategic advice, it's because you've designed the game in a way that creates this pitfall, whether intentionally or not, whether there's advantages to having this design or not, whether if they could just see the light and see the vision, they could avoid this and have the most fun ever. Whatever it may be, you design a game that has this trap that people can fall into, and you want to protect them. You want to make sure that they don't fall into that trap. And I think that when you find yourself wanting to give strategic advice in a teach, in a rulebook, in a tutorial, I think it's interesting to consider saying, why do I feel I need to do this? What is this trap that I'm trying to protect them from? And can I just throw something out, rework this mechanic, and avoid the trap to begin with? I don't know if it's always possible, but I think that is probably a good question to ask yourself. Um,
Mhm.
and anyway, I wanted to hear your thoughts about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're sort of touching on like the core of maybe our difference in the approach to this. That I do agree, like in the example of Dice Throne, when they put in just a little tip, it sort of made it feel like that was a weak point of the game design, and they still chose to leave it. And so there's a branching path there as a designer. Do you fix this, or do you think it's core enough to the game that for other reasons it still makes sense? But it is going to be an issue for a teach. It's always going to be a thorn because you had to put extra stuff in there as a little tip. I think that's a lot different than a game that decides to give you strategy that isn't protecting as you would describe. It's more that, if you put yourself in the shoes as a game teacher, if you ever think of a time when you would give strategic advice to one of your players, I think that's analogous to the designer giving strategic advice to the person that's going to teach the game for the first time. And so there are definitely instances of that happen as a teacher where I feel like the players want some strategic advice. So I think that's where there is a place for it. I had a different point that I sort of got. Hold on one second. Um, where's my train of thought? So, hmm.
No worries. We've talked about a lot of a
this
lot
is
of
how
stuff.
this is how ADD brain goes sometimes.
Hey, it's
It
okay.
goes that way.
Like I said,
Oh,
people are
oh,
getting
I got
just the authentic experience of us talking, and sometimes this happens.
it. So I'm trying to. I actually took a note on it, so I'm glad I looked back at my
Yeah.
note. So it's not that you're protecting them; it's that you've seen how these 10 pieces work together, and you think it would be beneficial to give them a little bit of a nudge in the direction before they understand how those work together to lead them down that path. So they're not in the middle of the game and they realize they're losing
Yeah.
and they can't win. So I think that's like the difference when I started. That's sort of the core of our disagreement. And I think that there are times when you want to move them down that path so they feel like they're learning along with the rest of the people or they're on the same page as the rest of the people that have played it before.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So, I think that, yeah, I do think that usually it is about protecting their experience. I mean, even you said earlier, it's about, that first playthrough is so important. And so
mhm,
you want to try to maximize the fun. And the way you maximize the fun is to make sure that you can call it falling into traps. You could look at it more optimistically, and you could say, see the strategic lines that's going to help them get themselves to a game state that they're going to ultimately have more fun with for the final 75% of the game. Which takes me to my next point, which is that I think usually what happens is you're trying to protect the first 25% of their game. I think that when I play, at least, I can
mhm,
say that um, I'll learn a new game. It's hard for me to, even if it's a really good teach, and you're a good teacher with games, you've done it a lot with me. Um, uh, but even if it is a good teach, there's going to be an element that didn't really hit home for me.
mhm,
So on one side of things, you got to teach the rules. If you want to also teach a strategic advice, how much of that is sticking anyway? What are the chances that the advice you're giving is really going to stick any more than a mechanic? And if there's always something missing after that teach, is it really beneficial to give the advice, or should you just focus on the rules? The other
mhm,
side of that is that I think that when I do have some sort of misunderstanding, it's revealed within the first turn or two. Whatever that looks like in the game. The first 25% of the game, I have this aha moment. I'm like, oh, I see what this is all about now. Or oh, I misunderstood that mechanic. I got myself into hot water here because I thought it worked this way. That's going to really
mhm.
screw me over for, the implications are endless. It kind of, the advantages or disadvantages of knowing or not understanding are going to really cascade from there. So I think that one thing that you mentioned earlier on in this discussion that I wanted to hit on, which I really, really like in theory, is a practice round. I really like teaches where we end up setting up the game. We get the basic teach, and you say, and maybe that is minimized a little bit. Maybe you cut 5 minutes off the teach, and then you say, okay, cool. So these are the basic concepts, but let's actually get into a practice round. We all go through the motions, and then you do a reset. If that is something that was encouraged within the rules, that is like way more in the ballpark of something I'm interested in. I think that is a far more elegant way of helping to protect that first experience than to give advice which might stick, might not, might lead the witness, might not. So I really like the idea of implementing, even within the rules, encouraging people to like do a practice round and then reset and do the full game, because I'll have my aha moment there, and then I can kind of go in with eyes wide open when I'm doing the full reset playthrough.
Yeah. That would be similar to what Oath was doing with their playthrough. It was like a full practice game that was guided, and they sort of spoon fed the rules as it went through. So there is a place for that. Um, I think that so saying that there's going to be a practice round and a reset sounds really good in theory. I don't agree that it's elegant. I think that's like the opposite of elegant. Elegant would be playing it and understanding it the first time, but I think it could be successful. So there might be a place for that. However, I think that every time I've tried to introduce a game, not every time, but the majority of times I try to introduce a game and say this is just a practice round. You get to the end of that practice round and say it's like the first round of a game that's going to go 10 turns. Everybody's like, oh, we should just continue. And so I'm sort of torn on whether or not that's a good strategy to include in the rule book or something you leave up to the teacher and the group,
Yeah.
because I've tried that, because in theory I feel like they would have a better experience if they took the time to do a practice round, but in reality they don't want to reset up all the pieces and take the time to restart. And so I think that's sort of the downside of it. I've just found it to work less often than it does work. And then the other piece of this, So as I've done the research on this, my opinion is sort of evolving, and I think that there's a very distinct timing of when you introduce strategy versus when you tell them rules. And I think that Dune was a great example of that, that it gave you a streamlined version of the rules. And then one of the last pages was a strategy page. Hey, go look at this if you want to. I think I think the rule book should mirror how teaching is optimized. And when I think about teaching, the time when you introduce the strategy is in the moment. So when somebody's about to make a mistake, you give them another piece of information to think about strategically that might help them into this game with a positive experience rather than feeling like, well, they screwed up here. Now they're playing for an hour and a half and have no chance to win. And so I think that's what we're at odds with. We need the person to, in their first playthrough, feel like they're competitive and have a chance to win. And we need that to happen in a streamlined way. And so I think the conclusion I'm coming to personally is that there's a time and a place for it. And that's not when you're introducing the rules.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, keeping strategy spoiler free is good, right? So like if you have it as a separate section, then that suffices. A
Mhm.
couple of things I want to hit on. I do think I agree. Elegant is not the right word to use, and that actually got me thinking that there's really nothing about elegant about learning a new game. Like it's not an elegant experience no matter what you do. And so it's not that's not a concept you should try to pine for when you are trying to make so. You want to be clear and concise with your rules. You want them to be well written. And I think you don't want extraneous detail. You want it to be to the point, answer the kind of questions they're going to have, teach them what they need to know, full stop. Um, but ultimately, that experience is all going to be just kind of a mess. It just always is, you know.
Mhm.
Okay, now I'm having my moment. What was the last thing you said? Because I had another thought about that. The last part.
The timing to introduce advice, it's like you do the
Okay,
rules
yeah.
streamline and then
Yeah.
advice will come when you need it.
Yeah, I do want to push back a little against this idea of like in the moment, let me show you. Like, I think that when I think back to experiences where this has come up, where someone's about to do a game action and it's ultimately going to not be good for them, I think I think sometimes someone stepping in and saying, "Oh, you might want to consider this." I think that can sometimes be a feel bad for that player because I mean, ultimately you have to just like you can't control how the social dynamics of this group. But I think having someone, I've come to this conclusion. I'm putting myself into this action and I'm doing this, and someone jumping in and be like, oh, maybe not. Then it's like, oh, well, now I either do what they say and then it wasn't my choice, or I don't and maybe feel extra bad about it. I don't know. I feel like
Mhm.
when I've seen that kind of interaction, the way that I felt like you were outlining it, I don't think it's a positive experience for the person who's about to make the mistake. I think once you're at that point, usually, usually it's better off they're just a learning experience. Um, I think it's possible that someone could intervene in a way that um, doesn't feel bad, but I think you have to be really, really good with your words and approach.
Yeah.
And if you lack a really solid approach, then I think that could cause more harm than good. Um,
I think the strategy that I would advocate for including are related to giving them pieces of information rather than choices. And so that's also how I would implement that sort of in the moment decision. It's more that they haven't considered this piece of information because the effort of learning a game and all the mechanics and how they connect together is often hard to comprehend all at one time. And so if you know by their decision that they're leaving out this important piece of information, then you might stop them, provide that piece of information, but don't provide a decision. And I think that's sort of how the strategy can be offered without a way that's like leading them directly to the water. So that's what I
yeah,
would advocate for.
Yeah, and I think that there is an approach that could work there, but I think at the end of the day, this person did 10 game actions and didn't get someone intervening, and now they do. I mean, people, gamers are smart, and so they're gonna sense that, oh, this person's saying this for a reason. I'm doing something dumb, and then suddenly you take the agency away from them. No matter how you do it, you are taking something away from them. It doesn't become wholly their decision anymore.
Hmm.
And I agree that it could just be a good faith like, oh, they're lacking critical information, um, but I think it's seldom gonna like feel that way. But anyway, I think that's kind of that's an interesting point, but a
Just to ask
little,
you a question
yeah,
though around that. Like I feel like you're arguing to not lead them too much, right? Like you don't want to lead
yeah.
them. But earlier, I think you also agreed that one of the worst feelings is being in a game and feeling like you don't have a chance to win that game and you've got 25% of the game done and another 75% to play. And so while I agree with you that like strategic advice is not ideal, I also want to avoid that other scenario. So where do you find that balance there?
Yeah, I think it does. I think the earlier on in the teach and the playthrough, the better that approach is. I think if you get further into the game, then I think it gets a lot worse. I think if you're still in the learning process, you're still trying to get from 0 to 80%, um, which I think is the initial teach and that first 25% of the game or so. I'm making up a lot of numbers here, but I think I'm in a reasonable ballpark. Then I think it might be good to say, it's their first main turn of the game, and they're about to do this, and you'd be like, that looks great. That's a legal move. But just so you know, I just want to remind you real quick because it's your first turn. Like these are your other options. Just I want to make sure you're fully aware. Like that feels pretty okay to me because they're still. It kind of feels like they're in the learning process. I think if you end up getting too much past that, too much further in the game, then it can fall into the pitfall that I was kind of mentioning. Um,
And so to bring this back around to rule books, I think if you can have your rule book achieve that sort of goal in a way that's streamlined to offer strategic advice that would offer that to this group that's playing it for their first time, I think that that's probably a net positive.
But your whole point was that it's not strategic advice. They're just aware of their game actions. And what a rule book does is it outlines the rules of engagement. It gives them the rules. And so I don't think you need to give a strategic advice for the rule book to be able to outline all of their options, right? It's kind of we're talking about two different things here.
No, so the way I described it, the strategic advice is taking these pieces that you've taught them and leading them how to put those together. And so they until they have the concept of how they all work together, they're going to go through that first game and miss those kind of things potentially. And that's the essence of the strategic advice you can give them, in my opinion, is that you haven't interacted with all these systems yet. Here is a way you can begin to approach this system, but don't tell them the depth of how to approach it. Just
Yeah.
like lead them a little bit down the road. So,
Cool. Well, we are an hour seven into the podcast. I think we covered a lot of good stuff. I'm just gonna call out Chris right now because before we started this podcast, he was like, "Oh, I don't think we're gonna, I don't think we're gonna have enough to talk about in this segment. So I think we're not gonna hit an hour." And I'm like, "Chris, don't bet against us not going down rabbit holes, you know." And I feel like we could literally talk about this for a lot longer, to be honest. And
okay, I've shifted my position that we will always have enough to talk about.
Yes, okay, good. But I'm going to pull, I think we were delving a little bit into a rabbit hole there, a rabbit hole within this whole macro rabbit hole. So I'm going to pull us out a little bit here. I'm going to round out the episode, kind of get a little bit bigger picture. Um, uh, on the topic of shifting your position, just I want to kind of end with this. Um, Throughout this discussion, have you shifted at all? Or even if it's not your overall position shifted, maybe there was a concept that we was kind of talked out here that it kind of changed the way you think about this.
So I think ultimately my position started out as put strategy advice wherever you want, even along with the rule itself, which is how I wrote the first rule book for Fibonacci's Harmony. I've since learned that it's very important to keep the rules streamlined and keep strategy separate if you include it at all. And so I think your goal would be to not include strategy. And if you feel it leads to a better experience and that's how you've chosen to design the ultimate game, then sometimes you can put some strategy in there, but try not to.
Yeah. I think that's a really good place to land, honestly. I think we probably both came a little bit more towards the middle here. I definitely um, was pretty religiously against giving strategic advice in general. I'm come around to the idea of maybe the Dune approach of having it as a separate section that they can opt into if they'd like. I
Mhm.
think there's not a lot of harm there. I do think you should get someone from one to three, level 1 to 3 out of 10. I don't think you should be trying to, as a designer, write the ultimate strategic guide to your own game. I just don't think it's your job. I think give that to the players. Let content
Yep.
creators, let other people who are experiencing your game, let them delve into it. And if they do, that's how you know that you've made a good game that has a lot to explore. And so I think there is possible, a reason to do that. I also think I like the conversation about just like the person who was teaching the game. It's not really for us designers, but I think it's an interesting conversation, and it does come back to us as designers because we are going to be teaching our own games to other people, and so I think that whole conversation was really interesting. Um,
Mhm.
and I'll be thinking a little bit more about the the best way to teach and whether or not you can, if not elegantly, effectively do maybe some like practice rounds to kind of help with that. Because that for me feels like the best approach, but in application maybe doesn't work too well. I can see that side as well.
Mhm.
Cool. This was a
But
great,
let us know in the comments. I think,
yeah.
do you like strategic advice with your games? When somebody's teaching you a game and they give you part of the strategy, is that a negative experience for you, or is that something you welcome? I'm curious what other people think as well.
Thank you for saying that. You're getting good at doing podcasts. I was literally going to say the same thing. So please mention in the comments. I'd love to hear your opinions of our opinions, and then also what you personally prefer or think is correct for game design. Cool. Anything else you want to say before I call this here, Chris?
If you have another debate topic for us and you'd like to see us go through this process live on a podcast, let us know.
Yeah, and even if we agree, I think one of us is willing to just play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
We love disagreeing with each other, so we'll find any reason to do it. Cool. All right. Well, thanks for joining us. This is episode 3. Till next time. Thanks. This is the RockFace Game Design Podcast. Bye.
Bye, everyone.